I need to introduce myself briefly. I'm an architect by training. I worked in practice for a number of years in London, Edinburgh and Vancouver. But I became an academic and I had a particular interest in green architecture. And I have published about 20 books on sustainability, not all on sustainability, but I tried to encourage both my students and practice to focus more on sustainable design. And one of the reasons for that was that after the UN summit in 1985, the Earth Summit, 3 important agendas were established for society. Environmental sustainability, which split into 3 different agendas: energy, environment and ecology. The second area was social sustainability. How can we use development to make life better, to make our communities stronger and our buildings healthier? And the third key area from the Earth Summit, which was 30 years ago now, not 10 years ago with Swegon and its seminars, but 30 years, was economic sustainability. How can we use new green thinking to regenerate European economies and strengthen European businesses, and to do so without destroying the resources of the planet? Now, those are really important agendas which set the context for my talk today. And I want to set, I guess, some of the background to why we have environmental certification, why we have environmental assessment. So I'm going to set some of that context. I'm also going to look at the evaluation of green buildings which have been certified to see how they really perform, and to look at the impacts they have had on economic sustainability and social sustainability. Much of that debate is contained in this book, which I wrote, called Green Buildings Pay, where we sought through a number of case studies in Europe and in North America to evaluate buildings which had been BREEAM and LEED certified, to see what were the benefits to society, to the companies that had built the buildings, and what were the lessons for the architects and engineers engaged in shaping the future. Now, I use the word future because the Brundtland definition of sustainable development is development, that's what we do, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we deal with futures. Engineers, architects, project managers, builders, contractors, we deal with futures. We create futures. And we have to be aware of the type of future we make and the type of benefits and costs which are involved. That's the context for my talk. And I'd be pleased if you wanted to buy the book. It's available, but I will share most of it in my presentation today, or some of it anyway. Am I going slowly enough for the English? Good. I didn't say very much about myself. Briefly, I served on the RIBA, Royal Institute of British Architects, Environment and Energy Committee. In fact, it started by being called the Energy Committee, professional group. Then we called ourselves the Energy and Environment Committee because we wanted a balance between energy interests and more general environmental interests. And it's now called the RIBA Sustainable Futures Committee. Futures, keywords. I have a PhD from the Mackintosh School of Architecture at Glasgow University and a master's degree in environmental conservation related to architecture. So the environment has been an important aspect for me. I'm emeritus professor. That means I'm retired, basically, but I still undertake research and research evaluation for the UK government on green technologies under a program called Innovate and Smart, and I still publish journal articles and books. And thank you, Swegon, for inviting me to share my thoughts. So, why do we need to assess the sustainability of buildings? Well, the assessment really comes from the need, thank you, the need to assess buildings in the context of that Earth Summit agenda. Clients require it. They want to know how one building, say this building, performs against another building, and what are the impacts. There's a growing awareness from society and from clients to know more about the environmental impacts that buildings have. Now, I'll look later at how that environmental impact is measured, but that's part of the background. Society wants to know because buildings consume around 40% of the fossil fuels for heating, lighting, ventilation. Across the world, 40%. 45% or so of all the water used is used in buildings. Some people claim that 80% of all the raw materials end up in construction. Roads, railways, buildings. So buildings have a really big footprint, a big environmental footprint, and we need to understand that. Also, one reason why we have environmental assessment is because damage, if we have poor design today within our buildings, we can create environmental costs, energy costs, health costs, which may occur for a long period of time. Typically in the UK, buildings survive now for around about 100 years. So the decisions we make and the buildings we construct carry consequences way into the future. Now, futures was part of that definition of sustainable development adopted by the United Nations. It's the agenda for the European Directive on energy. It's the context for so much of what we do. We need also to, we also need to benchmark sustainable design so that we can compare one building type with another, one design solution with another. Because we can learn from other examples. And we need also, finally, to climate-proof our buildings so that they can adapt and adjust to future environmental change, whether we're dealing with 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise or less. But we need to climate-proof our buildings. So environmental assessment and certification gives a framework for our clients and society at large to understand the consequences, the impacts that our buildings have. So one of the aims of environmental assessment is to agree what are the criteria against which we should score a building. We need also to provide an understanding of what that commercial value will be. So we classify buildings according to, in LEED's case, platinum, gold, silver. In BREEAM's case, outstanding, exceptional, good, and whatever. So we have a series, like a league table. You've got your Real Madrids at the top, and you've got your other lesser players further down. But what is the commercial value, the green credentials? And also one benefit of environmental certification is it creates green value, if you like, commercial value. One of the things that we found when we interviewed clients, they saw building certification as an attractive area in terms of being able to let office space or sell buildings. It's like a certification which provides a guarantee of standard which has business benefits. It has marketing benefits. In fact, when we interviewed a number of architects, big practices like Foster and Partners in the UK, Skidmore, Owens and Merrill in Chicago, we said, how do you present the green case to your clients? And the architect said, we don't talk about energy, that turns them off. We talk about the business benefits of green buildings. The image of the building, the ability to attract good staff, the asset value the building has over time. So certification allows for that marketing of the building. Now you might say it's not very reliable, and we'll get on to that, but that's one of the reasons why we have building certification. And finally, it allows a comparison of one building with another to see how it is performing and see how it can perform better. So trying to raise the standards. So the key elements of an environmental assessment system is we identify the criteria that is going to be measured. In most cases, it's energy. It's also water. It's indoor air quality. It's materials. It's the sustainability of the site. It's urban transport, put together into a package. It's not just energy. Michael's going to talk about Passive House, and that is just an energy assessment. And it's very good if you're only interested in energy. But if you want sustainable development, you have to focus on a number of other somewhat holistic and broader issues. The second thing is, having decided what we're going to measure, we need to give it a percentage of importance or give it a credit rating. So different environmental assessment schemes, whether it's in Australia or whether it's in Germany or whether it's in the UK, have different weightings and different points. You also, having decided on that weighting scheme, you have to decide on the final rating, the final assessment as a total package. I mentioned earlier, LEED has the term platinum to the top, then gold, then silver. Incidentally, they're all very poisonous. You wouldn't want to have platinum, gold and silver. It's a strange, they're valuable, but they're not, that's an aside, meant to be a joke, but they're meant to be, they're gradings, if you like. And of course, different building types pose different problems of assessment. So if you're dealing with a hospital or a school or an office, there are different weightings and different areas different ways in which that credit is to be assessed. And of course, different countries, whether we're in Spain or whether we're in Singapore, have different environmental priorities, different environmental pressures, and different climates, and different cultures. Now, I raise that because one issue which I think we should think about is there is a big growth in international certification. Certification like BREEAM and LEED. It's applied in Japan and China and the Gulf states. It's one of those globalizations. It's like McDonald's down there. It's like Coca-Cola. They are sweeping through the world as global certification. And one thing I think we need to think about is, should we have a Spanish system different from a Portuguese system, different from a Swedish system? So your climate and your culture and your systems are built into the certification. It's something to think about. I'll come back to that. So different building types pose different problems, and different countries have different priorities. So an assessment system, certification system, has to be able to respond. Now I'm talking for the next 5 minutes about the Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Method. The BRE, which is how it's normally abbreviated, was a UK government research centre based near London. And 20 years ago, Margaret Thatcher decided she would privatise a lot of UK government agencies and quangos. And she privatised the Building Research Establishment. Her government, that is, the Thatcher government. BRE had to make a living. It couldn't just be supported by state aid. And one very clever thing that BRE did was to establish an environmental assessment system which it could sell to the business community. The architects, engineers could sell a system to make some money. So BRE started as a consequence of the privatisation of a government research centre. And they decided in 1990 that with the UN Earth Summit 5 years earlier, there was a need to assess at the design stage the environmental footprint, the environmental consequences of a building, in order to guide architects and engineers towards less impact, towards less energy impact, ecological impact, and environmental impact. And that's the origin of the BRE. And it started off with assessment of offices. Offices was the first building type. This was because in London, in particular, London was moving over to financial services, out of manufacturing industry into financial industry and creative industries. And a lot of office building was going on in London and the southeast of England. So the BRE focused on offices with its environmental assessment system. Since then, BREEAM has moved to a number of other building types, which we'll come on to later. BRE is now being overtaken by LEED. LEED is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's now the global leader. America borrowed BREEAM, essentially, modified BREEAM, and is now successfully promoting LEED as a global standard. I'll come back to that. I'm talking about LEED as well. Up to now, about 500,000 buildings have been certified by BREEAM. There is a BREEAM website, so each building, you can learn about each building, the strengths and the weaknesses, and where the scores were attributed. So if you were designing an office building, or a school, or a housing in Madrid, you could learn from the cases which are on the website. It's true also of LEED. LEED has a very good website of cases. And one of the objectives of certification is knowledge sharing, rather like Swegon. People want to share best practice. People want to share also where the failings have occurred. Where is it? Okay. Okay. What BREEAM really seeks to do is to move building from the minimum in the regulations, the building laws and the planning laws, and push the standard higher and higher. So the really good projects right at this end are far more demanding, far more efficient than what the building regulations require. And one thing we can do is we can learn from buildings at this end, which may be zero carbon, they may have been built just with recycled materials or high levels, might use very smart new technologies, radiant cooling or whatever. But we can learn from examples and say, how can these really high-performing buildings inform mainstream practice? That's what the book tries to do. So BREEAM, sorry, I thought this would come up. BREEAM really recognises within this category outstanding, exceptional, good and certified, this band of very high performing buildings. Now the BREEAM for offices, well, versions of BREEAM cover these building types and more. There's a BREEAM in use at the moment, aimed at existing buildings and bringing them up to better standard. We only change our building stock at about 1% a year. So most of our environmental footprint and energy footprint and ecological footprint is in existing buildings. So BREEAM now has a BREEAM in use. And also because one change we've seen with certification is the move from an individual building and its assessment to looking at communities, urban design, and how the cities, how buildings interact with transport, with infrastructure, because a lot of those consequences were not measured. Early green buildings, some in this book, were in greenfield sites. Everybody drove in their BMW to go to work. In fact, Ramboll headquarters in Copenhagen, one of the cases in this book, when I interviewed one of the MDs, senior staff, they told me that most of the environmental footprint of Ramboll was in energy consumed in the cars of the staff visiting the sites. Only about 1% of the energy Ramboll used was in the building. I think 8% of the energy, 8% of the costs were transport costs. So the urban site that Ramboll, for its headquarters in Copenhagen, chose is on top of a transport interchange, linking through to Malmö in Sweden, Copenhagen and down into Germany. So staff use public transport in order to reduce the energy footprint of the company. Anyway, these are the different types. Oh, where has it gone? I'm back. All right. So, BREEAM provides a set of predefined criteria. I've mentioned that already, water, and we'll come on to it. Many of these have objective standards, particularly in areas like energy. How many kilowatt hours per square metre per year? Can we bring it down to 40 or 50? Other areas are less easy to measure, particularly some of the subjective areas like health and well-being. How can you measure the sense of healthiness that comes from having natural materials, natural planting, views outside, contact with the sun and the sky. But they're thought to be measured. So some are easily measured and quantified, and some are more subjective. Another problem is that certain solutions have been found to be certified to a high standard. Atria-based office buildings with 15-metre wings on either side. And that's now becoming a standard solution for many office buildings. So innovation and creativity can be suppressed, can be pushed down, because people know how to get a good BREEAM and LEED assessment, because you can learn from the cases which are on the websites. Also, not every design solution is readily measured. Related to that, one of the growths in architecture, we see it in China. Buildings have a mixture of uses: hotel, offices, residential, maybe gymnasium, spa, maybe laundry. BREEAM and LEED is set up by building type. How do you measure hybrids, mongrels? And yet the hybrids are very good because you can have an energy exchange between parts of the building. So the buildings operate more like an ecosystem of resources being traded between different uses within the tower. So one limitation of building assessment is that they only apply to single building types and don't adjust to hybrid types. And hybrid types are one of the futures. We see it with the railway station. It has lots of retail inside. It has transport. It maybe has a hotel on the roof of the railway. That kind of hybrid building is the future. So when we come to look at what is measured in BREEAM, there are 9 categories for which scores and points are earned. Energy is one of the 9 categories. And that's why a passive house, and Michael is going to talk about it, is very important, because it says if we maximise energy efficiency and energy performance, and we can generate energy from renewables, the buildings will be very sustainable. And that's certainly true. But one of the consequences of BREEAM and LEED is it measures and gives points to these other things. And energy is not always the most important factor. We will see. Now, of the points under BREEAM, energy is about 20% of the total credits. But if you add the materials, recycling materials, the ability to dismantle and reuse, if you measure the materials area to the ecological design of the site and its roof, green planting on the roof, it adds up more. It's 22%, adds up more than the 21 points for energy. So one of the weaknesses of building certification is it doesn't give enough priority to energy. In fact, under LEED, LEED uses the title Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. There's not much leadership in energy, according to some people. In fact, there was a court case where a company which had got a high LEED score said, this is not about leadership in energy, it's about leadership in environment and ecology, but not necessarily leadership in energy. And that vacuum is being increasingly met by passive house. So 2 questions about passive house. Does energy really matter to that degree? Or is ecology more important and the environment more important? Energy is a subset of broader agendas. Think about it. Another consequence of passive house is you can have a very high-performing passive house building, which can be quite damaging in terms of the materials that are chosen, in terms of the ecological impacts on the site, in terms of the transport costs. Most passive house buildings I know in the UK are out in the countryside. You have to drive there, creating urban pollution, which is a good example on this road, and using a lot of fossil fuels. One thing that LEED and BREEAM say, there are good credit points to be earned by sustainable sites. Let's use brownfield sites. So the two questions for passive house: does energy really matter? And if it does matter, how do you also, with high energy performance, meet the other agendas of ecology and wider environmental concerns? Michael, I'm sure, will touch on this. So these are the credit points. And this is how it kind of breaks down as a percentage in terms of, there are 104 points. It used to be 100. It made life easy, arithmetic, but they're now 104. So we have a slightly different percentage, but these are the percentage points. Energy is the biggest, but not the only one. This is BREEAM. And this is the classification. Excellent, good, very good, outstanding. And in order to do that, you have to achieve 85% more of the credit points available. Quite a strict agenda. This is an example of the 2008 calculation of an office building. And you can see that the areas which are being certified, the credit points, you can see the number of points which might be available here and the number of points which have been achieved, the percentage of those points and the score, and it adds up to 55. Good. BREEAM, good. But let's go back to energy. There are 21 credit points available for energy. This building only achieved 10. So it achieved less than half of the points in energy that were available. But where it does do well is in some of these areas. It does do quite well, well, materials maybe not so well, but it does do quite well in other areas. And rather like LEED, you can balance, you can gain easy credit points in some areas at the expense of doing the hard physics and the hard engineering in others. And that is seen as a weakness of BREEAM and of LEED, that there's not enough importance attached to energy. So this is typical certification. This is the woman receiving her certificate. Now, I noticed there were quite a few women in the audience. One of my students said to me, very perceptively, passive house is for men, BREEAM is for women. Because BREEAM does health and well-being, you know, all the nice soft things in life. Passive house does all the maths, all the physics, all the engineering, all the tough bits. But, and it's pertinent, we have the woman here receiving her certificate. That brings us back really to the starting point of sustainable development. It is seen as development, which addresses future needs, but not just future energy needs. Development needs much more broadly. In 2000, I went to a seminar a bit like this at O'Varup's office in London, and they were trying to chart the future of sustainability into the 21st century. And we sat and discussed it. At the end, it was agreed that health was more important than energy. Health was going to be the main driver. Now that health issue was defined by global health, climate change, from global health through to community health, air quality, big issue of air quality at the moment with the rigging of the emissions targets and the consequences in urban areas. We're trying to put more people into urban areas, so the CO2 and other emissions really critical to air quality. So we're looking at global health, community health, environmental health, but personal health. We spend 90% of our time indoors. We don't have open windows, so we trust all these systems are working. And when we're not indoors, we're out in the city. I walked around Madrid most of the day. Was surprised at the volume of traffic up and down all the roads. So, health versus energy. Think about it. I need to speed up. Code for Sustainable Homes is an area, which looks at housing. And it has certain standards. One area of BREEAM was on housing. And it looks at both design, which BREEAM measured, but also post-construction. When BREEAM started, it didn't look at post-construction. Buildings were certified on the basis of design. Then we started to realise buildings didn't perform as well as the design. Post-construction highlighted that. A current trend is to have post-occupancy evaluation 3 to 5 years after the building is finished and see really whether the systems are working. And make adjustments to the building. So there's a continuous learning curve within the building. Code for Sustainable Homes was made compulsory in 2008. Last year, David Cameron, our current government, decided it wasn't going to be compulsory. It's optional. So it's been removed from legislation. So BREEAM, which started off as being voluntary, became mandatory, has now gone back to being voluntary in the UK. These are the areas that are measured, very similar to offices and schools. What is different, though, is that energy is more important. The credit points available are much higher. This is addressing one of the problems with BREEAM generally. It doesn't weight energy enough, nor does LEED. But the Code for Sustainable Homes version, housing, gives more priority for energy. And we have a series of standards. Level 5 and level 6 is pretty similar to passive house. And we have some demonstration projects. BRE, if you happen to go to Watford, just north of London, has an innovation park where buildings have been built to test the technologies. And this is one example, built by Kingspan, a large supplier in the UK of building materials. And it's a zero carbon demonstration house. And here is another one, level 6. 6 ways to reach level 6, that's the top standard zero carbon, by Barratt Homes, which is a big volume house builder, using a different series of technologies, concrete mass, photovoltaics and solar thermal on the roof, here are the panels here, but triple glazed, very small windows, airtight, very similar in many ways to passive house. So when we look at other environmental assessment systems, we've got BREEAM for the United Kingdom, LEED essentially for the USA, Canada. The other big assessment system, quite recent, is DGNB, German system. And like many things in the German system, it's technologically and system advanced. It's well developed technically. And it measures more areas and quantifies more areas than BREEAM and LEED. And when I worked in Copenhagen for 3 years, the Danes were adopting DGNB as their standard. So if you're going to look at building assessment, I suggest you look at DGNB. It addresses, because it's quite recent, about 5 years old, it addresses some of the limitations of BREEAM. BREEAM started, a bit like Britain invented football, but we don't win anything any longer. BREEAM started it all going. LEED then borrowed some of the ideas. DGNB has pushed the science and the technology and the assessment forward. There are three to look at, but you can see different systems in different countries. Most of them are modelled on BREEAM, but have developed it in particular ways. Now I want to talk about LEED. 8 years after BREEAM, LEED came on. It's managed by the US Green Building Council. It only has 6 categories of assessment, not 9, which BREEAM has. And it has, in many people's thought, an environmental rather than an energy focus. In spite of having energy in the title, the focus is more environmental and more economic in many ways. The areas that are measured, sustainable sites. So that brownfield sites, contrary to much of American development where they're out in the sticks, it's saying let's get back and regenerate our urban, neglected urban core. So sustainable sites is important. Water efficiency is quite important. Energy is linked to atmosphere. Although only 6 credits are available, the scoring is high. It's saying that the consequences of energy use, fossil fuel or renewable, should be measured in terms of carbon footprint, not just in terms of energy measures as we might measure it, kilowatt hours per square metre. What are the consequences in terms of atmosphere? Materials and resources, indoor air quality. The focus on indoor air quality is rather similar to BREEAM on health and well-being. They begin to overlap, but the two systems don't have that much symmetry. Rather like BREEAM had 104 points, credit points, LEED only has 69. So it's a relatively simple system to understand. Energy and atmosphere is at 27%, it's the top, but only just. So here's a comparison. I won't labour the point between BREEAM and its 9 categories and LEED and its 6 categories. One area where LEED is quite interesting is it has 5 points, only 5, for innovation. It says buildings which are innovative, test new technologies, test new design approaches, should have credit points for that. This is to avoid stereotypes, to avoid duplication of the same type of solution. It's saying we need invention and innovation, and it gives points for innovation and design process, 8% of them up in the grey area. Quite interesting. So, it's the whole building approach. It encourages integrated design and construction. Because it doesn't isolate areas, it's saying buildings are holistic, are about interactive systems which we should consider as connected material, not as isolated material. In many ways, the economic benefits and the environmental benefits are the two main areas of interest in LEED. And then we've got certification. Remember, there were 69 points, so platinum, gold, silver, and just certified. So if you want to learn, if you're engineering or designing a building, and you want to learn what's going on in terms of best practice in America, go onto the LEED website, put platinum buildings, put office or school or hospital, and you'll get a series of case studies with measurements that you can, measurements in terms of water use and energy use, but also in terms of design approaches, which you may be able to learn from. This is a typical LEED scorecard. And when one looks at some of the area, daylight and views, you can get a credit point for having a view and having daylight. So if this building would be in LEED certified, we will be able to give ourselves points. But thermal comfort, controlling as a system, many of the LEED and BREEAM top buildings allow the workers to access the building management system on their laptop and their PC, and they can adjust the blinds, the temperature in their microclimate. And that gets a point under indoor air quality. So we've got all these different things that are measured, and the total comes to a score, which then gives you a grade. And I'll quickly run through some examples. This was the first LEED Platinum building in the United States. It's an environmental centre. It scores very well in terms of materials, recycling. All the materials in the building are either natural materials or they're buildings with a high recycled component. And the building is designed so it can be dismantled and elements reused. The water in the building goes into an ecological drainage system on the site and then into the building. So there are a number of factors in this building which make it, although not great architecture maybe, make it very interesting from a LEED point of view. And it has a high score. This building, which looks very average architecturally, is a LEED Gold project. And it's related to the University of British Columbia. And many of the innovative buildings in Europe and in North America have been the result of cooperation with universities. And we'll see some examples of that. This uses geothermal energy and has planted roofs, and what it does highlight, I think, is you can have a very high BREEAM or LEED score, and yet the architecture can be quite indifferent, architecturally indifferent. So LEED and BREEAM are no guarantee of design quality, they're only a guarantee of environmental quality. And many of the major architects, people like, say, Renzo Piano, don't bother with building certification. They say, my client knows that my building's going to be green. You know, I'm sufficient guarantee of that, and I want good quality architecture as well. This is the size of, I think, 12 football pitches, financial district building with 2,000 or 3,000 people working in it. And it doesn't have a lot of obvious LEED qualities, and we've moved down to silver. But it has light shelves and solar shading, and it uses geothermal energy for cooling. It uses within its systems, which are not very visible, quite clever green technologies. And this building, and what I wanted here for it, it's only a certified building, but it's the Ford Motor Company. So we have both universities trying to say, yes, we care for the future, we care for the environment, but also big companies like Ford. In the UK, companies like Barclaycard, financial companies saying, we want a good image for our company, and we're going to have a building which carries the certification. So let's have some general conclusions. This growth in environmental awareness is changing how we design and construct and engineer our buildings. The key driver in this, not coming from our professional bodies, it's coming from clients, it's coming from the business community, it's coming from the vice-chancellors of universities. They want it. They want a good image for their university, their company. They also want to attract the best staff. They want to keep the best staff. And the best staff will only work in the best buildings. Googleplex have demonstrated this. So if you're approaching a client with a debate about certification and assessment, talk about these broader issues and leave the energy debate to come along a bit later. So the image and the marketing and the financial benefits. One thing we found when we started to measure the performance of green buildings here was that several of them were showing an improvement in productivity of the staff within the building compared to the previous building that that company occupied. That improvement in productivity was between 3 and 4%. That paid for all the energy costs and the extra building costs, because a typical company, 50 or 60% of the costs are staff costs. So if you can improve staff productivity by 3 or 4%, it will pay for a lot of other design and engineering features. So what we found was that there were these benefits. And Genzyme, which I'll come on to, was one of the companies which have been able to retain the best staff and show measurable improvements through share price improvement and the number of new product developments in biotech, the result of the way the building had been put together under the influence of being a LEED gold building. So, financial benefits. As I keep saying, it's an environmental, not an energy measure. And one concern I have is the globalization of this, particularly with LEED in China, is it imports USA technology, USA products, USA design approaches, USA professional skills into China, at the expense of China developing its own indigenous Chinese set of solutions to problems. Now you might say it's an interim solution. That, China and Japan and India and Brazil will develop their own in due course. But it is worrying that if we say globalization is not good and we want local identity, local culture, we want Spain to be Spanish, then one has to resist the global influence of some of this certification and have your own systems, which you do have. This was a very early building, Barclaycard headquarters, 1,400 staff. This building was built in 1995, so we're now 20 years ago. But it's got many of the things that become quite standard practice. A large glazed atrium, a low south-facing facade sheltered by trees for shading in the summer, a big north-facing facade highly glazed, water collected in a lake, taken through the beams to chill the beams overnight, stack effect, natural ventilation, all very simple. But this was a building modelled on BREEAM for offices. BREEAM for offices was under the influence of this building. And this building, in fact, developed some of the BREEAM for office measurements. So, conclusions in terms of certification. Health and well-being is really important, and it's beginning to shape how buildings are designed. And health and well-being is one of the things that corporate clients are most interested in. Is this going to be a healthy building? Am I going to have productive, creative staff? Energy is not the only driver. I talked about that. Natural materials and contact with nature is seen as supporting a sustainable solution. You might say that eco-modernism is the new mantra, not necessarily energy modernism, if I can make a distinction. In many ways, buildings are part of a wider drive to greenhouse cities. We're starting with the buildings, we're moving out to urban design. Big interest now, particularly in China, in eco-cities. Let's have the master planning, the big decisions based on ecological and energy principles, not just the building. As I've said, BREEAM and LEED don't on their own produce great architecture. And another thing that's happening in the last 5 years or so is that clients are saying, okay, there are problems with BREEAM, but all right, there are problems with passive house. Why doesn't our building seek certification from both BREEAM or LEED, or Verdi, was it? And passive house? Let's set the broad environmental and ecological agenda, and let's have high-performing energy, because energy doesn't get enough points under my assessment system that I'm talking about. So we've got dual certification increasingly happening. Quickly, this is a building in London under the influence of facade engineering, but simply by tilting the windows through 27% on the horizontal and on the other facade on the vertical axis, by tilting the windows, they were getting a 27% reduction in energy use within the building. And of course we've got the atria through the centre for stack effect ventilation and daylight. And this building is built by British Land. British Land is a company in London, the major London company of office development in London. It's behind many of the buildings, cheese grater, that you might have heard about, and it only builds BREEAM excellent buildings. It won't build anything else, because it says you can't let or sell office space unless it's got the top environmental certification. And this is one of the buildings. This is a building in America's LEED Gold. President Obama made an announcement about 3 years ago requiring all government buildings in the USA to be LEED assessed. And it shows how LEED and BREEAM, to that degree, is creeping into the development and the political thinking and the development industry thinking. This is federal office in San Francisco, has sky gardens, different elevations, different ventilating facade systems for different angles of facade. I'm aware I have to go a bit quickly, because Petra will tell me to stop. So let's make a few conclusions about technology. BREEAM and LEED are driving new smart technologies. Some of them, of course, are being developed and tested by Swegon. But other companies, they're saying, if we want to achieve these high standards, and those high standards are being promoted by BREEAM and LEED, remember they were both way above the regulatory minimum, then this is leading to new smart technologies in our building. The main areas where we see these new smart technologies are the design of roofs and the design of facades. I don't just mean on top of the roof, but I mean between the ceiling and the roof. There's a lot of very smart engineering creeping in. Ecology and technology are being combined in interesting ways. We've had energy and technology under the impact of passive house combined in interesting ways. We also have ecology and technology under BREEAM and LEED and DGNB. And we have, because of the influence of materials, we have what's called cradle to cradle. There is no waste. Everything has to be recycled. Like the rainforest, all the wastes get back into the system and they work their way through the resource chain so they find expression in new life or new uses. This is NASA sustainability base. It's actually designed by William McDonough, who's one of the co-authors of Cradle to Cradle, which is another certification scheme, looking particularly at material choices in buildings. And this is a NASA building where they tried, it's part of Stanford University, where they tried to use science and technology spin-off from space stations and apply them within buildings. And because of that, the building achieves a very high standard, LEED Platinum. It's a case study in the book. I won't labour it now. Another case study in the book, University of Copenhagen, Green Lighthouse. The first zero-carbon building in Denmark. Phase-change materials, thermal storage, heat storage from summer to winter. A lot of very clever technologies and design approaches. And as I keep saying, the university, it's their science and technology centre, use it to promote their own image. So the business benefits. BREEAM and LEED are changing how clients view their building, whether it's their existing buildings or they're going to make a new building. Clients recognise that BREEAM and LEED and all the others can bring about business benefits. Green buildings measured as green buildings, certified as green buildings, bring business benefits. It's okay to say this building is a green building, but we need independent evaluation. And that's what BREEAM and LEED give you, independent measure of its greenness. Green is increasingly seen as healthy. Productivity in green buildings, according to the work we did and other research in Australia and America, is round about 4% higher. As I mentioned, it's been adopted by Obama in his executive order. And as I say, global clients, I'm not talking about national clients, but the companies that build globally require these certification schemes. I mentioned a certification and accreditation. When we interviewed architects in UK, Denmark and USA, in the USA 40% of the architects in the big practices were LEED accredited assessors. They had an impact on how the buildings were designed within the office, but they also went out and measured as a professional service the designs being created by other practices. In the UK, only 2% of staff in practices like Foster & Partners, Building Design Partnership, were BREEAM accredited assessors. And that shows a difference. In the LEED is very much seen as an important aspect of professional life, architectural life in the USA. So quickly run through some examples. Genzyme headquarters, biotech company, spin-off from MIT, now one of the major pharmaceutical companies in the USA. Built a brand new office, brought staff together from different places, and with a very clever atrium through the centre, and very clever triple facades with ventilation, and achieved, as I said, a lot of measurable business benefits as a result of high certification. Attracting good staff, retaining good staff, having product development, all the rest of it. Ramboll headquarters in Copenhagen as well. One thing I haven't said, one innovation, I've talked about facades and roofs, another one is atria. Atria started off as a space in which you could service the air and the ventilation and the temperature of the building. It's now a social space. It's now a space for networking. So people come out of their so-called silos and actually mix. And that mixing, this is what Googleplex has tried to do. That mixing of people from different parts spins off ideas. So the atria space, that public, semi-public space, is important within these building types. So national certification can reinforce cultural identity. So hold on to your Spanish systems. Global certification can undermine national identity, national culture. Some people say we should have a Europe-wide certification scheme. But of course that means that Scotland, where I'm from, and Catalonia would have to obey the same set of rules. It doesn't make sense. We have different climates, very different climates, different cultures, different ways of building, different environmental priorities. Scotland produces a lot of renewable energy. It's wet and windy, hydro, wind. So we don't want a Europe-wide scheme. The split between energy certification and environmental certification may be a bad thing. Maybe we need a convergence. Michael will talk about that. And finally, buildings in use do not perform the way they are meant to in design. Some people are saying we should remove the certification. You know, it can't stay LEED Platinum for life if it's 40% less well performing in energy or water or something else. But that hasn't happened yet. So, China, East or West? These are both American companies building Skidmore and Merrill, Pearl River Tower, and Gensler, another tower. But you can see how the technologies being imported on the back of, they're both LEED certified to a high standard. But also the technologies are very good for energy efficiency and very good from other environmental points of view. But I raise it as a point of something to think about. Now the title of the book is Green Buildings Pay. I didn't make that title up. The British Council for Offices had a conference at the RIBA when I was on the committee. When BREEAM had come in, they said, we know what's happening with these buildings in terms of energy and environment and ecology, but what is happening in terms of the business case? Are the business benefits and are the social benefits? So we set up a conference with the help from the UK Department of Energy, Government Department of Energy, to say, how do green buildings pay within the context of sustainable development? And can we make some measures? So we had some case studies, and there are now 45 case studies. They're sort of touched on in there. And we say that green buildings pay generally if you bring the three main impacts or costs down through certification. You bring those costs down through BREEAM and LEED. The ecological costs, the energy costs, the environmental costs. You bring them down, and then you balance those reduced costs by these gains. And the gains are gains in productivity or performance within the building, not of the building, but within the building, through people like you working more creatively, working in a more committed way, working longer hours, and not going off to work for somebody else after 2 years. You're committed to the company because of the quality of the building, and you're more productive. The building itself has an enhanced image and commercial value because it's got that plaque on it that says you're now LEED Platinum. You know, it's a kite mark, it's a star, a sign of quality, environmental quality. That enhanced asset value gets greater over time. That's British Land's view. Over time, the asset value improves because there's more environmental legislation, more energy cost, more ecological concern. So there's less exposure to regulation in the future. 100 years on future, 50 years on future. And finally, the benefits are to the user because of the measures that are measured under LEED and BREEAM about health and comfort and well-being. So just to summarise, I'm sorry if I've gone on a little bit too long, BREEAM and LEED have had good impacts on what we do. They are the future They take on more and more impact within the development industry. There are problems. I mentioned the big schism between Passive House and BREEAM. But Michael, I think, will elaborate, certainly will tell us what the benefits are of Passive House. But that's one concluding comment. Think about the difference between the two. And the other concluding comments I'd ask you to think about is how within a Europe where we have the free movement of professional services, the free movement of people, how can we retain our cultural identity through building assessments so that, in my case, Scottish stays Scottish. In your case, Spain stays Spanish. Because if we have a Europe-wide system, or we start adopting a system like BREEAM or DGMB across all the European boundaries, it will make the free movement of labour very good, because you'll be able to take the system and apply it anywhere. But the consequences of that, culturally, I think, can be quite damaging. I mean culturally in terms of design culture, and building culture, and material culture, and climate. So thank you.